All right, so my disclaimers. I took 9 pages of single-spaced notes yesterday, and they were actually not comprehensive. I've selected a few of the threads that I heard, so my comments right now are going to be even more selective. And this is really about what I heard, not necessarily about what was said. And with a few of my own observations and questions thrown in. And I've sort of grouped threads of discussion that I heard. So the first sort of group of threads that I want to mention are about the nature of genetic technology and on science and technology more generally. Marsha Darling started us off by talking about how the genetics revolution is creating a new threshold. And for the most part, comments I heard on the nature and effect of genetic technologies, on new biotechnologies, agreed that the notion of that these technologies are different, new, greater change agents than previous technologies, if you will. So they agreed with that point. We use the terms and concepts genetic determinism, genetic essentialism, geneticization as we used them yesterday to describe the new ways in which we define ourselves, each other, our relationships, and our communities. And we use those terms as points of critique rather than mere description. At the same time, the new biotechnology provides new vehicles for historically rooted ideologies and practices such as biological race and eugenics. Those points came up in discussion. Yet we face new difficulties in proving the pernicious uses of these technologies for at least a couple of reasons that came up. One is a popular belief that biotech will overcome social stratification, as Dorothy Roberts pointed out. Another is the claim that science is real or truth, a means of seeking truth. Dorothy used the example of Sally Satel's distinction that positions genetic race as truth and social race as ideology, for example. As some put it, science is a kind of faith, and there's an overwhelming faith in science and scientists. And I would push a little on that idea. I think it might be more useful to say that faith in science is privileged or is premised on the privilege we give to knowledge that we call science. That is, science is a form of privileged knowledge that is privileged over the other types of knowledge. And that privilege reflects in part the greater value that we place on technological expertise and on the idea of neutrality as opposed to the kinds of expertise that we bring to bear in forming cultural knowledge, experiential knowledge, social knowledge. For example, those types of knowledge are typically regarded or cast as subjective, natural, feminine, indigenous, primitive, and therefore less valuable than scientific knowledge. So perhaps one additional question we might think about is how are we ourselves using the appeal of neutral principles, our neutral principles, in ways that undercut the ways we have challenged the neutrality of science. Another set of threads about new technologies in the marketplace that I heard. Throughout the afternoon, there were critical comments about the role of the market in technology development, use, and distribution. And for the most part, I heard those comments as a critique of neoliberalism and perhaps as concern about slippage between the liberal notion of autonomy-based choice into free market individualism. There were some modulating voices. For example, Jonathan Kahn called for discussion about balance between the market, individual needs, responsibility, and civil society. Others in discussion spoke about the demonization of the market without knowing more about how it actually operates. What I thought was interesting was the way we use market as if there is a monolithic, independent, and free-acting entity, as if it stands alone, free from ourselves and culture. I also found interesting Joe Stramondo's discussion about the generational difference in the community of little people, about the willingness to talk about the double dominance effect. He pointed to the older generation's use of libertarianism to avoid the discussion and the way the younger generation, LPA, has used clinic imposition of genetic norms to raise the discussion. So he pointed to the double edge of free market thinking. Throughout the day, we elaborated on the idea that Carmel Shalev first stated, that technology creates dependency. And what emerged by the end of the day was this trajectory that had been laid out. The availability of technology gets turned into desire, largely through the market, which then ratchets up into need and then expectation and the pressure to use that technology, in vitro fertilization being the primary example of that. And then, as Lena Gugacheva said, to a claim of right to use that technology. This trajectory rests on the fact that the existence of a technology also defines the problem, the need for it, that it apparently fixes. And for the most part, genetic technologies are set up as fixes that locate the problem within the individual. That is, they frame the problem as located within the body and divert our attention from socially located root causes. Adrian Ash, another set of comments, Adrian Ash called upon us to consider why society should care about symbolic harms and to show why symbolic harms might be more than symbolic. And I heard bits of a continuing thread of commentary on symbolic harm and on commodification in particular throughout the day. Marsha Darling, Carmel Shalev again, and others provided a strong critique of ways in which new genetic technologies commodify the body, and women's bodies especially. In the roundtable discussion about intergenerational concerns, one speaker observed that commodification concerns resonate less than tangible harms with the younger generation. There were also several conversations that got to the ways in which notions of choice and agency are used to counter commodification concerns. And at the same time, perhaps there's a sense or assumption that we are so extensively commodified already that expanding commodification of oneself is an act of agency. So perhaps in continuing this discussion, we could include at least these 3 points. The first is Margaret Radin's point that there is a continuum or trajectory that has and can happen that starts with objectification of a person, a group of persons, a population, that can and has at other times and places moved to commodification, which then provides a platform for subordination of that group and members of that group. And the next 2 points have been made by Renee Zelitzer, among others. One is that we can hold intrinsic value and extrinsic value simultaneously. I think that counters the assumption that either you're commodified or you're not, that they're two mutually exclusive positions. So commodification does not always completely erase the other ways in which we value humanity. And then we might ourselves then think in our own discussions about the ways in which commodification acts in concert with other forces, patriarchy and white supremacy, for example, to accomplish a complete commodification. And then the other point from Zelitz's work is that things that we have commodified do not always stay that way. So in her work on Pricing the Priceless Child, she talks about the ways in which formerly we valued children largely in economic terms, the costs and the value of the labor that they bring us. And then we've moved to a point in which we value children largely more in intrinsic terms. And maybe we fear that that's slipping back with the talk about designer babies and stuff. And I have 13 seconds left, so I'm going to end right now. Thank you.